Hello, my name is Noel Bell. I'm a psychotherapist based in London, and today I'm chatting with Brant Cortright, who's the author of three books, Brant, but the one in particular that we're going to discuss in this interview is Psychotherapy and Spirit, which was recommended reading on the integrative transpersonal course at CCPE in London.
Hmm.
And I was there 2011 to 2014. So in person, almost virtually. Thank you for helping me get my assignments done and ensuring I got good marks. Actually, brilliant book on
Thank
the
you.
basic assumptions, the working principles, and excellent references. Can we just start? Page 17 always jumps out at me when you say it is hard to understand how psychology, which has tried to discover the truth of human existence, could have avoided the realm of spirituality for so long. What do you put that down to?
I guess it's because the founders of modern psychology, Freud, Reich, those in Freud's inner circle, the founders of rational emotive therapy, most of the founders of the different schools of psychology were atheists.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had no use for spirituality. And also they were trying hard to be scientific. They were really trying to make psychology a science of persons. And so I think those two things together made spirituality off limits for a long time in psychology. And this whole vast realm of psychological wisdom of the world's spiritual traditions was just left aside until recently, until transpersonal psychology really came onto the scene. I mean, Jung began it, but the field of transpersonal psychology really said, okay, any psychology is going to be incomplete unless it includes the spiritual. And so the transpersonal agenda really has been to integrate psychology and spirituality into a single whole.
And it's ironic, isn't it? Given that the transpersonal, the so-called newest kid on the block, has taken on board the perennial philosophy. And if you listen to Wilber, maybe there's two perennial philosophies, but for this purposes, let's just say the perennial philosophy that goes back centuries. So, I mean, is it a naive question to think why, with these great scholars, were they avoiding all that the perennial philosophy was saying for so long?
It's really interesting. This historical fact of spirituality being left out of psychology, there's something when you begin your training as a psychotherapist, when people began, like in these early psychoanalytic institutes in Vienna or behaviorism with Watson or with Reich, there's almost a cult-like atmosphere there. You feel like this is the truth, and this is the most important truth and the most central truth, and others are either lesser or not so important. And so there is a kind of disparaging or minimizing of other approaches as you, I think, find meaning in the particular school that you're into. And I think that continued for quite a long time as psychology developed. And in many ways, it was really, at least in the West, psychedelics in the 60s that just opened everything up. They
Yeah.
just exploded the whole scene and blew up the whole materialistic worldview to see that, yeah, there's a lot more going on than just a purely physicalist explanation can account for.
Yeah, and Woodstock and the rest of it. Yeah. So, Brant, what do you? Your background is in clinical psychology.
That's right.
So, what do you take from psychoanalysis?
Well, I think of psychoanalysis as, in some ways, having really invented the field of modern psychology. I mean, there's so much that we take for granted now that was brand new when Freud was first starting. Now, contemporary psychoanalysis has evolved a lot over Freud's initial formulations. But this idea that who we are as adults is significantly determined by what happened to us as children, that was a brand new idea. That dreams are significant. Wow, that was Freud's idea. That there are parts of our consciousness that we're not aware of. That there are defenses against feelings. And all that brand new stuff until Freud came along. And I think of classical psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, as describing a particular dimension of human consciousness. In integral psychology, I talk about body, heart, mind, spirit, making up this whole spectrum of human consciousness. And this level of the heart, or the emotional being, we can talk about as existing in three levels: lower, central, and higher levels of our emotional being. And this lower emotional, this instinctual realm, was really quite beautifully mapped by Freud and the classical psychoanalysts. And they came up with this idea that our instincts consist mostly of sex and aggression, different sexual derivatives and aggressive derivatives. But contemporary psychoanalysis sees that there's much more going on than this. And I think also that as the lid of repression was lifted on Victorian society back in the 1900s, early 1900s, that society itself changed. And this lower unconscious that had been repressed got integrated. And so it didn't loom so large. And even towards the end of his life, Freud began to think that the energies of the psyche are not just instinctual, but also the self. The ego itself has its own energies. And that's kind of where contemporary psychoanalysis is. It really sees that the self, this central part of the emotional being, is organized by our relationships. That we are fundamentally relational beings. And that the self emerges in a web of relationships with mother, with father, with caregivers, these early attachment figures. And these early attachment figures, we internalize their images of us, and we internalize these attachment patterns, which we then tend to play out the rest of our lives in various forms, unless we do some kind of inner work that really opens up our relational possibilities so there's greater relational freedom. And I think of Jung as like sort of the third piece in this. The third is analytic psychology. Talks about this higher realm of the emotional being. And that is imaginal. That works with symbols. It begins to take on a mentalized quality, a more visionary quality. And so I think of psychoanalysis, classical, contemporary, and Jungian, as having mapped this whole emotional dimension of consciousness quite well and quite thoroughly. But of course, there's others. There's the cognitive dimension, which cognitive therapy talks about, this mental part. And there's also the body, because our feelings emerge out of our bodily experiencing. That was Wilhelm Reich's big insight. And that also seems to be corroborated by contemporary neuroscience, right? For Freud, feelings were mental events.
Mm.
Reich, for Wilhelm Reich, feelings emerged out of our bodily experiencing. Contemporary neuroscience has shown that Reich was right, that the brain organizes feelings in two different ways. The left brain, which is our dominant hemisphere and is verbal and logical, organizes emotion in terms of narratives, in terms of words. We talk about our feelings. But before the left brain knows how to describe a feeling, it needs to know what the feeling is. And that it gets from the right brain. And our right brain gets our feelings from a primary body sense, from this heart, gut, torso area of the body. And it's based on that that the left brain spins a story of what it is we're feeling. So it does seem like our feelings emerge out of our bodily experiencing. And so Reich was right. And so all of the existential therapies, the body therapies, Gestalt, the somatic therapies, even Rogers, client-centered therapy was theoretically rooted in this organismic view, in this view of the body as primary for our feelings. And so that's really how I see Western psychology kind of organizing. It leaves out the realm of the spirit, and there we get the spiritual traditions to really tell us about our inner being. But the Western psychology describes this outer being, this body, heart, and mind. It just leaves out our most fundamental, most essential part, which is our spirit. Our soul.
Yeah, now, there are a lot of people who, when they hear the word spirit and soul, they see those words and the concepts as, well, some see it as an alien concept. How would you describe spirit and soul?
Soul, I think of as our deepest individuality. So I think of the world's tradition, the world's spiritual traditions, as lining up in one of two ways: traditions of the personal divine and traditions of the impersonal divine. So much of the West has grown up under traditions of the personal divine: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, which see the world and this whole universe as a creation of this divine being. This divine being is imaged in the West in primarily masculine terms, but in the East, in the Bhakti traditions of India, it's imaged as male, as female, as both male and female at the same time, Shiva with half male, half female body, as neither, as both, but still as a presence, as a being. And our soul is a portion of this being. And it exists in a relationship of love in these traditions of the personal divine. And in many of these traditions, the soul is located in the heart, or actually in Hinduism, certainly in integral philosophy, integral Vedanta, it's located behind the heart chakra on an inner plane. And it is what evolves lifetime after lifetime. It's the essence of our identity. And it's the personal, individuated part of our consciousness, as opposed to our spirit. And spirit comes out of these impersonal divine traditions. So Buddhism, Taoism, Advaita Vedanta, it also exists in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but it's less well developed there. see the divine as this vast impersonal consciousness. You can talk about it negatively as emptiness. You can talk about it positively as Satchidananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. But this ultimate reality, Brahman, the divine, is one with our spirit, called Atman, or Buddha nature. And this is the Atman that is Brahman. It is identical with that, in essence. And at this level, it's beyond individuality. This is universal. This is non-evolving and universal. And most traditions stop at one or the other realization as the ultimate. And what the perennial philosophy talks about is both of these. And certainly in integral yoga, integral philosophy, both of these are part of our spiritual being. We have both a personal soul that evolves over lifetimes, and we have an impersonal Atman, or Buddha nature, that is universal and one with all. And that both aspects are important to develop. So that would be the level of spirit, Atman. And soul is this level of individual spiritual identity.
Yeah, so where do you see that in relation to the elements?
To what?
To the elements, the four elements, and do you see inherited qualities against divine qualities of the individual and soul nature that gets lost maybe in impressions the soul gets through whatever it is, schooling, families, bad experiences? So can the job in psychotherapy to be to get behind whatever has been laid down as veils or whatever impressions the soul has received?
Mm. Yeah, that's a nice way of talking about it. I like that. I think that's right. That psychotherapy in some ways excuse me, deals with the veils, deals with many of the obstacles of the soul's full effulgence. And that the soul comes in with a certain karma, a certain mission, a certain lessons to learn, aspects of consciousness to develop. And it also needs to overcome certain obstacles in that development. It's not just a simple process of self-expression, but we have to develop ourselves. We have to grow. And part of that growth involves overcoming obstacles. And some of those obstacles are in the form of wounds, are in the form of karmic relationships with our parents that are difficulties to be worked out. And much of the time, the working out is only minimal. And one of the extraordinary innovations of psychotherapy is that it shows us ways that we can work out these emotional entanglements which become crystallized in the psyche and which prevent further growth. So I like that way of looking at it, that psychotherapy provides a way of working with the veils and also of then freeing this sort of soul program, that the authentic self is a kind of expression of the soul on this particular lifetime. And as we align with our authentic self and work through and erode the defenses that keep this self from coming online and bring it into our lives more and more, that it's more and more tuning into the soul guidance as this happens, more and more tuning into this deeper inner guidance, which ultimately comes from the soul.
So, and in the other interview that's available on the same channel, we discussed your practice. When we were messaging, you were at a retreat in Brazil. So I know you live what you talk about. If I was to ask you now, in your current level of consciousness, who are you in relation to who you thought you were, say, in your teens? What would the distinction be? Given that you have developed a psycho-spiritual level of consciousness.
These things are difficult to talk about. It's a very interesting question, though. I think that what has developed for me is, over the years with a regular meditation practice, has been an opening to the inner being more and more. I wish I could say that my contact with my soul was an established realization that was uninterrupted, but I haven't gotten to that level yet. So I can't say that I'm grounded in that reality. It takes focus for me to tune into deeper levels. But they seem more and more available as I tune into them. And of course, I think spiritual practice for most of us is a multi-lifetime affair. It's at least a lifetime practice. So there are inner realms that I was completely out of touch with as a growing child and teenager, and which initially it was psychedelic drugs that opened up these possibilities, but then it was really a practice, a psychospiritual practice, which allowed greater and greater access to these. I mean, the psychedelics are wonderful, I think, for if they're done in a responsible way in a psychospiritual context. But to really live in the places that they open up, I think demands some kind of psychospiritual practice. Spiritual practice is helpful, but I think a psychological practice is also helpful because a purely spiritual practice so easily leads to spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
And avoiding the psychological issues that are there. And that those also need to be worked with. And the spiritual traditions tend not to have well-developed tools to work with the psychological obstacles, whereas the psychological traditions have really designed tools to work with the emotional defenses and obstacles that are there. So combining both psychological and spiritual work, I think for many of us in the West, has been really important.
Yeah. At the risk of getting even deeper than we've been chatting, can I ask you how you feel about death?
I feel great about death. From all that I have experienced and read, it seems to me quite clear it's just a change of consciousness. Death just involves the body, that's all. This consciousness will continue. I think it'll be quite interesting to see what happens afterwards. I used to be quite frightened of it. I'm not aware of feeling that at this point, more just interest. I'm hoping to stay around on this plane for a bit longer, but when it comes, I think it'll be a new adventure.
Did you ever, can I ask you, have you ever feared death in your earlier part of your life?
Oh, sure. Well, I was an atheist for many years. Throughout my teenage years, and for many years, death was just the biggest bummer there was. It was just like overwhelmingly hard to deal with. And so it wasn't really until, again, it was, for me, it was the psychedelics that sort of blew the lid off of this materialistic trance that I had been in. And so it changed gradually over the decades. But early on, yes, that was hugely scary.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Everywhere you look, certainly in the West and probably in the East as well, although I haven't traveled so extensively in the East, but there seems to be an aversion to dealing with death. You know, we see that in anti-aging medicine.
Yeah.
We see it in, Botox, dyeing hair, and there seems to be an unwillingness to really confront death. And I've got a colleague who works in a hospice where some people, you know, men and women dying, will confront their own physical demise in a serene way, and others are screaming.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know quite what the question is here. Is it one's own psychospiritual development that makes a more serene approach to physical demise, or it's not societal?
That certainly makes sense to me, that people are at all different levels of evolution with this, and you're right that the Western societies as a whole have been very phobic about death and tend to just want to avoid it, right? What is scary and hard to deal with, we tend to avoid. We become phobic. And death is the biggest, scariest monster out there for most people. And certainly it is for the body, because it's the body that dies. And most people have a pretty strong identification with themselves as being just this organism, just this body, heart, mind organism. So that's absolutely right. It seems to be changing a little bit, like with the hospice movement, with end of care counseling, end of life counseling care, but slowly. And I think that some people approach death very well prepared for it, and other people, you're right, they are dragged kicking and screaming into it.
Yes, so when we think of an integrative model of psychotherapy,
think of a what?
Of an integrative model for psychotherapy practice, and how much of a component of that would be the existential approach? You know, when they say we have to align ourselves to the givens of life, and failure to do that will create problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is right, that the existential schools deal with a lot of issues just head on, without a kind of overlay of theoretical interpretations, such as this is an Oedipus complex or something, but really, what is it to choose? What is it to deal with the fear of death? And in dealing with those existential issues, the existentialists stop short of a spiritual solution, most of them. They deal with the existential void, but it stops just short of the spiritual void that opens into a divine vastness. But I think that the existential schools are very important. They deal with existential realities, and they also deal with the body, with showing how much, when we are wounded, we leave our body and move into a headspace. move into our minds. And so this dissociation between mind and body is also endemic in the culture. It's part of the general neurosis of the culture. Most people are pretty dissociated from their bodies. And the existential schools, along with the somatic schools of therapy, try to heal this dissociation. So the existential schools, and Gestalt would be among them, seek to bring the person back into their actual sensing, the actual senses in the body. And that allows us to deal more, to become more in the here and now, to live a life that is very much more present-centered than before, and dealing with these existential universal issues, as you're saying. Yeah, I think it's a huge part of any integrative approach to psychotherapy.
Yeah. When we think of maps of consciousness, and you refer to, it seems, most of them in psychotherapy and spirit, when you think of, Ken Wilber, I was going to say, it might be a bit too trite to say, do you agree? But are your views of consciousness consistent with Ken Wilber?
I think of Ken Wilber as a very mixed bag. He's not a clinician, he's not a therapist. And so I know a lot of therapists in this field, and I know one who finds value in Ken Wilber's work clinically. Most people I know don't find much value in it clinically. But he also says some good stuff. His clinical work, I think, is his understanding of psychology and the way he ranks them. It just doesn't make sense. It's really useless for that. But the idea of different levels of consciousness, I think that is a good idea that is also in other systems as well. He's been a bit too influenced by the Buddhist impersonal divine school, in my mind, and is not really so balanced between the personal and the impersonal, would be my own critique of his ordering of the different spiritual traditions. But he also has come up with a lot of good ideas that are important in transpersonal psychology, such as the pre-trans fallacy. This idea that a baby is enlightened, as opposed to a baby has a pre-personal consciousness, but not a developed transpersonal consciousness. So his pointing out some things like that, I think, are of real value. And a lot of people get turned on to the field of transpersonal psychology through Ken Wilber. He reaches a lot of people. I think it's very helpful in that way. But I think his map, I know very few people who subscribe to it at this point. I think there's just so many flaws to it that are pointed out that I don't think that many people that I know take him that seriously anymore. But he also has good stuff here and there. So again, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. And sort of talking that clinically, when you're seeing clients dealing with people who come to you with real everyday problems, clinicians one to another, we tend, or at least I speak for myself here, we tend to theorize, and we do it in supervision, group supervision. But I don't think I've ever had a client yet who's come to me wanting to know the theories. Clients want help. So in your mind, as a clinician in the client work, are you thinking about theory, or do you have at the back of your mind a map that you might refer to to dictate or to guide your approach and your interventions with clients?
When I'm actually sitting with the client, I think of the theory as being implicit. I'm not generally thinking explicitly in terms of theory. I think it's there as like a support for how I see things, how I view things. So I think that theory is really helpful for allowing us to empathically attune to levels of the client's experience that we wouldn't get to on our own.
Mm.
For pointing out dimensions of what they may be feeling that it would just be too hard to come to on our own. So afterwards, when I'm writing my notes, I'm reflecting on it, or discussing it with a colleague, at that point, I more think about theory explicitly. And as I'm doing my notes, then I begin to think, well, how does this make sense? How can I understand this? What are some ways of making sense of this? But in the moment, it's very much background, and it's only afterwards that I could really sort of explain what was happening, or understand it explicitly.
Sure. Now, at this point, we should make reference to, we have another separate interview on your latest book, The Neurogenesis, Diet and Lifestyle, Upgrade Your Brain, Upgrade Your Life. But it would be appropriate at this point to at least touch on that now in the context of your clinical work.
Mm-hmm.
So you're a clinical psychologist with within a transpersonal framework.
That's right.
But you're bringing in neuroscience and a multifaceted approach to lifestyle, diet, as well as the psyche. So how do you do that? I mean, how does it all work?
Uh-huh.
Are you, first and foremost, a transpersonal therapist, or are you a counselor, or are you a scientist?
Uh-huh. I think of myself as first and foremost a transpersonal therapist, and an integral or holistic psychotherapist, which means body, heart, mind, spirit. Every level is important to our being.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this latest book, in talking about the brain, I am more and more interested in how the quality of our brain supports all of these other functions of consciousness, supports our emotional, cognitive, and spiritual levels of consciousness as well. You know, in the United States, and I imagine this is true in Britain as well, childhood anxiety disorders have increased by 5 to 8 times since the 1950s. And depression in childhood has increased 8 times since the 1950s. And this isn't just because of new diagnosis or more therapists. This is basic standardized tests that have been done since the 1950s. And there's also a whole bunch of new diagnoses. ADD, autism's higher. It's just, in general, way higher. Why is this? Have parenting practices changed that dramatically in 50 years? I can't believe it. Things don't change that fast. Increasingly, I'm beginning to think that there's a very neurotoxic environment that we're living in, and a very neurotoxic diet that we are eating as a Western culture that involves high sugar, high carbohydrate, and high amounts of unhealthy fats that degrade the quality of the brain. And so increasingly, I'm seeing that these high rates of anxiety and depression, which I see in my graduate students, I see it in my clients. There's statistics to back this up. 1 in 4 women in America between 25 and 45 is taking an antidepressant.
Wow.
This is extraordinary.
Mm.
And people's brains are operating, I think, at a level far below what is possible, what is optimal. And so part of this latest book is to bring our brains up to higher capacity. I mean, we tend to think of the brain as either it works or it doesn't. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's not right. It's kind of like in psychology. It used to be either you were sick or you were well. Well, we now realize that's not the case, that what we think of as well is actually normal neurotic. And the normal neurotic is well below what's possible, way below what's possible. And so in psychotherapy, we're working to really rise people to a higher level of functioning, so our brains are operating at a subpar level. And so this book is really about getting the brain to a higher level so that we have much more possibilities, cognitively, emotionally, as well as spiritually. In some ways, this book is kind of, I think of it as like stealth spirituality. It's kind of get in there, but it's a crucial part of the whole thing.
Yes, because there are a number of, we talked about the breakthroughs, and the book will go into great detail about that in terms of the lifestyle, diet, the things we know now through neuroscience, and the things that are within our gift to implement both at the individual level and at the societal level. Are you optimistic about your future dreams in this area? Because I love the fact that you have a little section on each chapter, future dreams. How optimistic are you about some of your recommendations happening?
I'm extremely optimistic. I do believe that this whole vast universal existence is a slow evolution of consciousness. And so moving from unconsciousness towards greater and greater consciousness over long stretches of time. So if humanity began, at least culturally, about 50,000 years ago, where we'll be in another 2,000 years even could be amazing. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better in many ways. But it's like things are getting better and worse at the same time. It's like Charles Dickens said, it's the best of times and the worst of times. Things are better and worse, but in general, things are probably going to get better in terms of the environment, in terms of neurotoxic just factors in the environment. But I do think that there is this deeper movement towards wholeness, towards health, towards spirituality that is part of human consciousness, that is part of the soul, that there is this urge, this aspiration for a better life, a higher life, for wholeness.
Yeah.
That we each have, and which is more powerful than anything. So the long view is very optimistic. The short view is it's probably going to be a bumpy ride to get there.
Yeah, yeah. And in Psychotherapy and Spirit, you reference the 12-step fellowship community, and you talk about the 12 steps within a kind of the concept of your definition of psycho-spiritual development. And in terms of addiction, I think I've just paused because I'm not sure what the reference was. I think it may have been Metzner who talked about addiction being a narrowing of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Is it a bit simplistic to see all addictions as a narrowing of consciousness or not?
Yeah, I think of it, Stan Grof's work with addiction talks about he talks about addiction as a negative drive to alter consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
A negative sort of mirror image of an expanded state of consciousness, which the person is really seeking for, but which, due to various circumstances, they're not pursuing. You know, in AAA or 12-step programs, the idea is that this God-shaped hole inside of all of us is trying to be filled, not with God, but with material things, or with drink in this case, or with drugs, but that it's ultimately a spiritual solution here.
Yeah.
And AA was, I mean, it was very psychological for its time, back in the 1930s. These days, I think it's also helpful to augment it with psychotherapy, which has a more developed map of working with the psychological dimension. But it's a beautiful, wonderful, magical community. And when a person gives up drugs or alcohol, there's a big emptiness in their lives. And that emptiness needs to be filled in large part with people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of distance in people's emotional relationships with addiction. And AA and NA and the various 12-step programs provide that instant community. And that support is also really helpful. So it's a process of spiritual surrender, which is very powerful in the Western tradition and in the Eastern tradition. Really trusting in a higher power to work for our highest good. And they are open to working psychologically and do to some degree, but working with a therapist who's also trained in this area, I think, is a really important adjunct for most people who are struggling with addiction. So to see it as really a search for higher consciousness, as well as a form of emotion regulation, as a way, but really unskillful emotion regulation, right? It's like, in some ways, addiction is one of the least skillful forms of emotion regulation. The alcoholic wants to feel better. They wake up in the morning, they feel terrible. They want to feel better, so they have a drink. Well, in the immediate term, they do feel a little bit better. They feel less bad. But as you know, over the long term, that leads to actions that lead them to feel worse and worse and worse. So learning new forms of emotion regulation, including opening to realms of spirit, inner sources of peace, of love, these are very helpful.
Absolutely. We're probably coming towards an end. Could I just ask you, in terms of being an integrative practitioner, critics, and I'm not one of them, you'll understand, because I'm an integrative practitioner, but some critics would argue we're jack of all trades, master of none.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that criticism?
Yeah, I think it can be a fair criticism. If a person's not well trained in some of these approaches, it can be a kind of eclectic mix that doesn't deepen enough in any one of them. So I think of psychotherapy as, it's one of these professions where we learn our entire lives. You never master this field. There's always more to learn about the human psyche. And it takes time to learn some of these approaches. It takes time to learn contemporary psychoanalysis. It takes time to learn Gestalt or existential therapy or a body-centered therapy or Hakomi or cognitive therapy. These things take time to learn. And we, throughout our careers, learn different techniques, different theories, different approaches, and hopefully can integrate them. But that's right, that you can't learn this in just 6 months or a year or two. This takes years of learning. And the danger is just dipping in a little bit to each of these. I think it's a fair criticism. But I would counter it by just saying, yes, but you can go deeper into them and integrate them over longer periods of time. And that a truly integrative psychotherapist, really, depth is not opposed to breadth.
Yeah, because I remember being at a party chatting to a Kleinian therapist, and I just mentioned to her, I forget what we were talking about, but I'm sure it was something early. And I just asked her, did she ever use, I mean, it was probably a dumb question at the time. I asked her, did she ever use the empty chair technique? And she just said, no, because I haven't been trained in it. And I thought, well, how much training have I had in it? And so when I think, there's practitioners that are from a purist tradition, and their supervision has been around that specific approach. Yeah, they are pure. That's what they do. They play one instrument, where we're maybe playing a few different instruments in the orchestra.
Yeah, and as we're learning a new approach, we experiment with it and try it on. And unfortunately, we're not going to do it necessarily perfectly immediately. It's going to take us some working with it. But over time, we will learn to use it more and more.
Yeah. Well, it's been great chatting with you, Brant.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, fantastic. Highly recommend Psychotherapy and Spirit, and your new book, The Neurogenesis Diet and Lifestyle, is available on Amazon.
Yes.
And as we said, it's a book for every home, and it's groundbreaking in what you say. So thank you again for your time, Brant, and people can find you brantcortright.com.
That's right. Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, actually, talking with you.
We dealt with the technology, and it's quite amazing. I was just thinking, actually, we were chatting over Twitter, and we're using this video conferencing with is it an 8-hour time difference? Yeah,
that's right.
It's pretty seamless.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah, so maybe something for neuro-healthy economies. At least if we embrace the good side of technology, we're bringing people closer together and sharing ideas. And this will go on YouTube, a free platform. And yeah, I think they are the positive aspects of being able to disseminate information much more widely than we could even up to 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it is amazing. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, Brant. Thank you.
Okay.